Hi, this is Paul. Hans-Georg Mueller just recently did a video on identity using ContraPoints, and I want to do some talking about that because I think using the language that John Vervaeke has given this little corner about the agent-arena relationship can actually help in organizing a lot of our thought about a lot of the issues that are going on today. And I want to, because there's a lot, when I did my video about ContraPoints, there's a lot of talk about what pronouns should be used. This is a biological male, call him he. This is a trans woman, call her she. This is a woman, this is a man acting as a woman. So, well, when Flip Wilson played Geraldine, we called the character Geraldine, she. When Sandy Duncan played Peter Pan, we called her him because in the story, he's Peter Pan. So in the context of the Flip Wilson show, Geraldine was a she. What would we call Flip Wilson if Flip Wilson stayed in character as Geraldine all the time? Because Geraldine is a female character, even though we understood that when Flip Wilson plays Geraldine, a female character, when we're talking about Geraldine, we're calling her she. Now, in the PVK, is PVK too soft, nuanced, and winsome on Tucker Carlson, when we had our little 5-person conversation, we talked quite a bit about kayfabe and politics. Part of what's happening in our culture is that the agent, the arena is changing, and Sam leaned pretty hard on that, and I thought he was right. I thought he made good points in the conversation that with changes in the arena, a lot of things are getting scrambled. It's been very interesting to see how many different YouTubers have transitioned while they have been on YouTube, and this is more than just Mulvaney transitioning on TikTok. So the What Do You Meme channel had been following Chris Tyson, who is Mr. Beast's best friend, and Chris Tyson has been transitioning, and marriage broke up, and that led to conversations about children, and so this has been. What Do You Meme has looked a little bit at Mr. Beast's Christianity and then this. So something is happening in our world with respect to role playing and the arena that we live in and the way that these screens are impacting our arenas. Now, I wanted to go to this plastic pills video that I had played some of before. And he talked about the obscene, and I thought he made some excellent points here, so let's hear some of that.
Philosophy, or like political philosophy, tried to come around and say, no, politics is actually about freedom, or the general will, or a magical world process of self-consciousness. Oh, and that stuff has really always been the original cause. Oh, writing the cause after the fact. Now, someone like Trump's not dangerous because he did or will do anything really worse than any other president. He's dangerous to the system because he's obscene. Now, the scene of politics is an invention by political philosopher types. The scene is supposed to be this proper, dignified.
And again, there's all sorts of, there's the agent-arena relationship of the political debate. Now, for a very long time, everybody has noted that these presidential debates in anticipation of either primaries or the general elections, they're not really debates. Well, what are they? And And of course, Trump very much disrupted that in some ways because he was just a different beast on the stage. And again, when you look at this black and white picture of Richard Nixon on the stage, you can very much see that, wow, things have changed. It's black and white. And people pay a lot of attention to sort of the arena and the way that it molds the agents and the way that the agents behave in the different arenas.
Dignified drama of two competent, intelligent men or women selected to debate over the future of society. And then the respectable newspaper columnists give their evaluations.
Now, again, you can see how technology, bit by bit by bit, has been transforming these. And of course, we had these little crawls with Mitt Romney and Barack Obama of pluses and minuses, and people are watching them. They're making up their own minds, or are they? Because when everyone says plus, maybe if they're a contrarian, they say, no, everyone's always wrong. Others sort of think, oh, everybody thinks he made a great point, therefore he must have.
And then finally, reasonable people everywhere go and make their informed decision. That's our scene.
And that, if you look, this must be from the West Wing. So that's not even from a real presidential debate. But notice how you can sort of set the arena and how that then establishes us, and the television is sort of bringing it back to us.
The obscene shows that whole process is a big theatrical production. It's a show. Politics is not, and never was, some rational, dignified process. It's better and probably more accurate to think of it as which hairless ape can seduce enough of the energies of this big blob of people that doesn't really care that much to be involved, especially if it takes any effort.
Now, I don't know if I agree exactly with what he said, but his point about Trump was very important because, of course, one of the things that Trump did again and again is if there was an outcome that he didn't like, he would say it was rigged, it was fixed, it was unfair. He would keep making that point, and then even after the election, basically he'd go into election and say, I'm going to win, and if I don't win, then it's rigged. So then when he won the election, well, of course it wasn't rigged because I won, but then when he lost the election, well, of course, it was rigged because I didn't win. And of course, Georgia is going to have a little bit of legal things going on back and forth with respect to that. And what happens then is, again, you have this scene and the obscene, and you sort of pull the curtain back, and now we're going to see Oz behind the curtain, but then what does that do? And people have these kinds of experiences all the time. People have these kinds of experiences if they, how the sausage is being made. Old story about, what is it really like to work in the legislature or in Congress? Well, there are deals being made, and I'll vote for this and you vote for that, and we're going to compromise on this, and we're going to look the other way on that. And, congressmen lately some of them have been making noises that when the camera is on, people are doing all these loud, flamboyant things to get the attention. And then when they get into back rooms, well, then suddenly, now we're going to have to make a deal because I want these things and you want these things, so maybe we can compromise. And then in terms of our politics, some people say, you compromised, you sold out. Well, maybe they did or maybe they didn't. It's always a question. Is a compromise a selling out? What exactly are the non-negotiables and what are the negotiables, and which are which and where are they and what must you do, et cetera, et cetera. I got into a bit of this with the Tucker Carlson video.
Really care that much to be involved, especially if it takes any effort. And I guess the novel point here is that this isn't news.
Dishonest people.
Because it's always been like that. And nothing that Aristotle or Locke or Kant wrote changed any of that. At best, they just changed the props on the stage here and there. The spectacle is not hiding anything, actually. It's making everything transparent, putting everything out there. I'm thinking this might be a little bit hard to swallow. So another example, how about relationships? and love and sex, the spectacle also shows those for what they always were, a scene.
Well, I have an idea that I think will make us both feel much better.
Okay.
And that is if we each hold one of my nips.
Okay.
These nips.
And of course, if you watch enough of The Bachelor or Bachelorette or many of these shows that are on TV, you have all of this liturgical language. He's not here for the right reason. She's not here for the right reason. I'm here for love. I'm not just going to get more Instagram followers, et cetera, et cetera. And so you sort of deal with these different realities. Of course, media has long been about suspending disbelief. Iron Man can fly. His suit can travel all over the world. When he summons it, all the little pieces, and they'll magically come right onto his hand. We believe all this stuff because, well, we do. That's sort of the arena, and the agent and the arena work together. And in fact, your identity is a function of a particular arena. So what we see with this is that a lot of these different situations, the arena, and the agent, are sort of in a relationship. They go back and forth. Powerful agents change the arena. Trump in many ways changed the political arena. Now it's not going to stay static. It's going to continue to morph. There's going to be elements of the arena that are much more durable, and elements of the arena that are much more flexible. And different agents will change them as things go by. Now, I think especially with the transgender conversation, this gets interesting. And some of the stuff I learned from this video were helpful because there's a lot of, okay, what exactly it does ContraPoints believe and assert with respect to dressing up like this, surgeries, hormones. But again, ContraPoints is someone that is living in a screen. At least for me, I assume ContraPoints is also living this way out beyond the screen. But of course, most of us have no access to ContraPoints beyond the screen. And so we're watching this go on. And so I actually found this video to be quite interesting.
Now, what is gender identity? At one point, ContraPoint expresses a critical awareness of the fuzziness of this notion.
All this talk about gender identity, a lot of the time, I don't really get it either.
Now, my aim here is to clarify this confusion with ContraPoint's help.
And again, it's helpful to notice that, okay, gender identity is a part of the conversation. It's a very specific part of the conversation. It's one of the most controversial parts of the conversation because anyone apparently can make a decision about their gender identity at one time or another. So if I decided that I'm a woman, well, that now I'm a woman, and how dare you contradict me? Or no, you have to do other things that make you a woman. And I'd made that video about before using the Plastic Points video about the fact that there's this other layer to it. So then you've got someone like ContraPoints, and what's going on with this person? And what we see is that a bunch of different layers begin to get revealed, and actually in many ways more confusing.
Now, to start with, I have a basic agreement with ContraPoints that goes somewhat against the mainstream. Gender cannot be essentially or substantially defined. I reject a gender metaphysics.
Okay, now you really got to listen to this guy closely. Gender cannot be defined. Oh, that's a very skeptical thing. If gender can't be defined, is it of any use? Well, it seems to be of enormous practical use. A whole lot of our world, a whole lot of debates. In fact, if gender can't be defined, then in many ways, why would you talk about feminism or masculine and feminine? So it can't be defined, but not metaphysical. Oh, okay.
And when ContraPoints says she doesn't get it, she rejects ontological, neurological, and metaphysical, supposedly true determinations of gender.
Now, he just used she for ContraPoints. And you might add, okay, well, in what way is ContraPoints a she? Well, Flip Wilson's Geraldine, or Tyler Perry's Maddia. When Tyler Perry is playing Maddia, we'd say she. When Sandy Duncan was playing Peter Pan, we'd say, or various female actors would play Peter Pan. Peter Pan is a boy that doesn't grow up, but often they would have women play Peter Pan. Of course, Shakespeare very famously at the Globe Theatre had men playing women's characters. So Lady Macbeth was a she, even though it was a man playing the role. So when we're using pronouns or titles or a lot of these other things and even names, I remember, was it Balaji? So there's a guy on Twitter who often talks about Bitcoin, and I remember he had a very interesting podcast that he was talking about names and pseudonyms. You actually find this name thing fairly commonly in the Bible. You get to the book of Revelation again, and people are named. You have naming in the book of Genesis. You actually have naming all throughout the Bible. Naming is also often a function of the agent-arena relationship, because the lord of a particular arena in naming, creates something determinative about that person about that agent within the arena, about that object or substance or thing within the arena. Now, we're going to find Hans Georg Mueller to be very skeptical. He's going to very much be, in fact, almost nihilistic in this conversation.
Here's what she says.
Am I really, truly a woman, ontologically, neurologically, metaphysically? Well, honestly, I don't even know what that would mean.
There is no essence to gender.
Okay, right there. There is no essence to gender. Okay. Then to what degree can we actually use the term? Now, one might say, well, gender is functional within a specific arena. And the meaning of gender is important with respect to an arena. So right away, here we have ContraPoints being also with Mueller, a skeptic.
There isn't something essentially unchanging, forever fixed, a priori determined.
Okay, now what he's doing there is sort of pulling back and saying, imagine the greatest possible arena. And in many ways, a lot of that language he's pushing against Christianity. And one of the things that Christianity brought into the world from Judaism that I've talked about before, Ezekiel Kaufman, in the Hebrew conception of God, which is different from the pagan conception of the meta-divine realm. And so Mueller is saying you push it all the way back, that gender is not functional within that massive godlike arena, or even arenic godly.
Eternal male or female. And attempts to...
Now, when we start talking about gender and human beings outside of the arena of this, now I say this dispensation, that doesn't make me a dispensationalist. That's a theological word commonly used with respect to, from, let's say, creation that you find in the Bible until the book of Revelation. So for Christians, the arena in many ways is sort of within the biblical text. One of the things that the biblical text does was establish the arena. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And then at the end of the book of Revelation, you have a new heavens and a new earth. Now the dwelling of God is with man. So the Christian Bible in many ways sort of establishes this arena, and God isn't really within the arena. That's, again, all of those videos that I've made a few years ago with respect to Ezekiel Kaufman and the Hebraic perspective as opposed to the meta-divine realm and the other perspective. So right away, Mueller wants to be skeptical with respect to this long-standing, pervasive Christian assertion about the arena that we live in. Very quickly, however, because he doesn't use any of this language about agent and arena or arenas, you're going to see that part of modern nihilism is also a tremendous amount of flexibility within different arenas and a lot of question about, well, how on earth do these arenas actually relate one to another? And even more difficulty, how do they react in terms of hierarchies? Which arenas tend to trump other arenas?
Define gender beyond all cultural and historical contexts.
And again, when you say that, okay, is Geraldine, I should probably pull it up because by that example, I'm dating you. So this is Geraldine. And it was a very popular character on the Flip Wilson show, and you can find a lot of episodes of Flip Wilson playing Geraldine. Because, of course, Geraldine lives within a specific arena.
Is a useless endeavor.
Some bullshit semantic debate about what is a real woman. This is metaphysics, and life is too short for metaphysics.
ContraPoints is very clear here. She says,
So I personally don't believe in any gender metaphysics at all.
in a strict essential sense, there is no true gender. Gender is not something that defines people on an ontological level of being. It's not something one...
And even when someone says on an ontological level of being, they're very much slipping into philosophical language.
Truly is for once and for all. Importantly, if there's no gender metaphysics, there is also no gender theology. Gender is not God-given. And therefore, ContraPoints...
And it's not God-given. Now, you got to be really careful here because it's not God-given because for him, of course, there is no God. And this is the way in which I think people leverage their use of pronouns in order to make assertions. So if I call ContraPoints he, I'm basically making an argument about God. And that's true. That's exactly what they're doing. Now, if you look at Matt Walsh and What is a Woman, he doesn't really go that far. He's much more making sort of a materialist biological claim and saying biologically, this is a man. But you see, well, metaphysics in terms of God, there's an arena. Biologically, there's an arena. Flip Wilson on TV, Geraldine is a she. Flip Wilson, the actor who plays Geraldine, is a he.
Also speaks out against any scholastic gender theology. Moreover, there is not just no God-given gender. Gender is not even in a secularized version something that one is
And what you see, if you listen to him, and actually Cale was doing this quite a bit in the conversation, if you pay attention to agent-arena relationships and you listen to people closely, what you hear them doing often is sort of flipping through arenas. So, and that's sort of like flipping through frames. So in a secular perspective, so okay, now we switched. And actually in this video, he's quite loose with respect to a lot of the language. Now, is English a second language? I suspect so. He speaks with an accent. I don't know. His English is excellent, but generally speaking, with a lot of this conversation about language and gender and sex, we use man as gendered, but male as biological. But he doesn't conform to that.
Fundamentally born with. ContraPoint says,
I wasn't born a woman. I was born a fucking baby.
so if there's no gender...
But she was born a male baby. So then male, the biological arena, baby, a developmental arena, because you can say baby without specifying male or female, because you're putting it then in a temporal developmental arena. Male and female, you're putting it into a medical or a biological arena. Because, of course, doctors will treat a baby biologically according to what's at hand. And this, of course, has caused a great deal of confusion in medical schools when, someone with a penis comes in and asks for a pap smear, or someone with a vagina comes in and asks for a prostate exam. A doctor's going to have to think long and hard about that, or maybe not.
Under theology, then gender is not sacrosanct. It's neither of divine origin, nor is it an unalienable value.
Okay, so again, all he's doing when he's talking this way is trying to differentiate arenas, but because he's not actually naming that this is what he's doing, a lot of these debates boil down to being sort of fast and loose with arenas.
It's, in practice, contingent and negotiable. In this context, ContraPoint...
Now, part of what he gets from from not paying attention to arenas as he makes his argument is, in some ways, he gets sort of political culture war. There's an arena. He gets culture war points because he doesn't have to make cases like, well, man or a woman. Well, what arena are we talking? And maybe I was doing the same thing in my video when I called ContraPoint she, because I would call Geraldine she. I would call Maddie a she. I would call Peter Pan he, even if a woman was playing Peter Pan. Because Peter Pan as a character is a boy. And so I use he for boy. Part of the thing that occurred to me a couple of weeks ago with respect to they as a pronoun is that I've always found it annoying, and I found it practically annoying because when I engage in conversations where someone is repeatedly using they to refer to a singular person, especially the longer the conversation goes, I don't know, for example, how many people need rides in my car if we have a bunch of people going by they. Does they need one seat or two? And I have a reputation for being sometimes too nice, but in real life, I can be a little less nice about some things because when I get annoyed about practicalities, I tend to get more direct and say things like, does they need one seat or two? Because I need to know because I'm planning the trip. So, but they, in some ways, we as human beings are always kind of in this position of multiplicity or singularity. And our singularity, in some ways, now I'm talking about the arena of a human being, and even more specific, an arena of a moral agent. When Legion in the New Testament, Legion is all over the place. We're working on the parking lot. If someone is confused about how they are internally, or if someone is duplicitous, it's not a thing to say. Now, because someone is going by a pronoun like they doesn't mean they're duplicitous, but it does ironically signal they are struggling with integration, let's say. And having said that, I'm sure I will tick off a bunch of people, but it's very interesting that the plural was the pronoun of choice for at least some in that group.
Speaks out against what she calls feminine essence theory.
The feminine essence theory says that trans women are female souls in male bodies, that we are women from birth to death, and that transition is merely an effort to make our accidental exterior match our essential interior.
Now this is a very common thing, and I think, so on one hand, we struggle with clarification because clarification is helpful. On the other hand, clarification is uncommon. And once people hear something like a boy born in a girl's body, that sort of takes up resonance in a culture like every time a bell rings, an angel gets its wings. They're kind of the same thing. It's people have a sense, and then words, and then cultures find words, and then everybody sort of migrates to agree with that. I was thinking this morning of the development of the word woke. Woke is now a term that is in our culture that everybody sort of knows what it means. And my channel predates sort of the implicit cultural agreement around the naming of this thing called woke. And I remember for a while, people were calling it different things, and eventually they sort of settle on woke. And so this, obviously, ContraPoints and Mueller are a little bit more sophisticated, and so ContraPoints makes the point that ContraPoints does not believe that, I'm talking about the YouTube character now, she is a woman born in a male body. She has no such metaphysical belief or theological belief. And then the question is, well, then what's going on?
ContraPoints here talks about trans female gender, but I think her criticism can be generally applied to any form of gender essence theory. A gender essence
Now basically, Mueller's going to be about against essences in general, which might sound attractive, but you're going to need essences or you're not really going to be able to handle much. Often that kind of skepticism just sort of, you can carry water in a plastic bag. You take away the bag and you just have a wet floor.
theory would say something like this, namely, gender is an essential and therefore immutable interior quality of the soul or brain or mind or spirit of a person.
And see, I would want to argue that if you introduce sort of an arenic awareness that almost all these identity tags are functional within arenas. And even if their essence is difficult to explain, if something is fundamentally essenceless, it's probably not going to be terribly functional within a specific arena.
So, gender is an essential quality of the true self. I guess it's safe to say that ContraPoints rejects such a gender essence theory. And I reject it too. And the main reason why I reject it is that I don't think that there's a true self to begin with.
Now that's very interesting. There's no true self to begin with. Well, what on earth do you mean by that? Because if you're driving and you get pulled over by a police officer, identity is going to be essential. You can't sit in the car and say, Geraldine was driving, not me. Well, who's Geraldine? Well, Geraldine is a character from the Flip Wilson show. Oh, okay, but you're sitting behind the wheel, and so in a legal sense, you have a name, and you are a character, you are an agent, and that agent is subject to a whole variety of things within an arena. And so if you are driving within a nation state, or in the United States, one of our states, there are all sorts of impingements upon you.
There's a second fundamental agreement with ContraPoint. Chromosomal sex is biologically conditioned.
Okay, so now we have an arena.
And there are, broadly speaking, from a chromosomal perspective, only two sexes.
And it goes beyond the chromosomes.
Male and female. ContraPoint says,
No trans person thinks it's possible to change chromosomal sex. So when transphobes say sex is real, they're not actually contradicting anything most trans people believe.
And in many respects, we've done a lot of talking about this word real over the years. It's of tremendous utility to notice that real sometimes means the governing arena, and sometimes it means the majority of arenas, or the accumulation of as many arenas as possible that impinges on a particular essence within.
We can simply quote Wikipedia here. In most mammals, females are XX and can pass along either of the X's. Since males are XY, they can pass along either an X or a Y. So babies are not born essentially male or female.
So, are you learning how he's using the word essentially? He's saying that, well, essence is a function of theology and all of this old language that we have done away with. So, well, okay, so what are you going to say? Assigned at birth? No. Human babies are born within the biological realm, and generally speaking, the social realm has followed the biological realm for a large number of really important reasons.
They are born with either male or female chromosomal sex. Yes, there are intersex phenomena as well, but they are very rare exceptions. So this brings us to what Simone de Beauvoir already indicated in the 1940s. We need to distinguish between sex on the biological level of chromosomes and gender on different levels, especially on the psychological and social level.
Okay, and so this is the convention that for a long time has sort of held, that in order to distinguish arenas, we're going to use different words that refer to this biological reality in distinction, in contrast with certain performances and certain arrangements that are within other arenas,
as well as on the cultural and historical level. When de Beauvoir famously claimed that one is not born but becomes a woman, she referred to gender. On the one hand, she affirms natural, inborn, male-female biological sex differences, but at the same time she regards gender as a social psychological construct.
And of course, a lot of the feminism in that day, the second wave feminism, had a lot to do with dress, work. And again, all of these are arenic. Dress is often a function of other social arenas. You don't wear a tuxedo if you're going to play hockey. You don't wear ice skates in church. And again, we very easily navigate many of these arenas, and so a lot of this conversation was dislocation. Again, first through the Industrial Revolution dislocates a lot of it, and the waves of cultural, technological, social changes have continued to disrupt many patterns, and so then we have these conversations.
And this is confirmed by ContraPoints.
When we say that someone is a trans man or a trans woman, we're talking about psychological and social identity.
So, yes, there is...
Okay, two arenas, psychological, social. Overlapping arenas often, but there they are.
a true or biologically factual sex. And it is, at least as of yet, immutable. However, gender is something different from sex, and it is potentially subject to psychological and social and even bodily transformations.
Okay, but then you've also got to ask, because many of these arenas are interconnected and nested, what then is the relationship between sex and gender if you're using gender in a different sphere? You can get rid of the word gender and just use sex all over the place. And in many ways, gender is sort of a word that's snuck in from language, because one of the things that, especially if you grow up English speaking and then you take Spanish, you begin to learn la mesa. La mesa, that's feminine. And el teléfono, that's masculine. You sort of learn this. And then when you learn Greek and Hebrew, suddenly you're learning masculine and feminine all over. And in Greek, you've also got neuter.
So here's a short summary of the main points. No gender theology. No.
He says this multiple times, which, in fact, this is the last word that he says. No gender theology, no gender theology. Oh, okay. And in that sense, people who say ContraPoints is a he, you're in a direct conversation with this guy because he's playing the same game. He's saying no gender theology. Why not? It's not an argument. It's just a demand, basically. No gender theology. It's in the imperative. No gender theology. You're not making an argument about that at all. You're just basically telling us you don't want to play on that level. Well, why? Because this whole game on another level that the other side is playing is saying ContraPoints is a he because God. Sort of playing the same game, but not connecting any of the dots. Maybe don't need to connect the dots because this is the fight that both sides want to have. Unfortunately, there's a lot of people in between that are just watching this go back and forth, and it's just confusion.
No God-given gender. No gender metaphysics either. No essential gender. No eternal feminine or eternal male.
Okay, so eternal, so you that's this God arena. And okay, no God arena. Oh, okay. Well, what arenas are we allowed to talk about?
And importantly, no gender meta-psychology either. There is no gendered soul.
Okay, basically same thing. Nuances, because different religious traditions have different ideas of what the essence of a person is. And in some ways, in Christianity, your soul is your essence. That's sort of how it's commonly used. And he said, there is no such thing as an essence to a person. Okay. Well, in some ways, you've just sort of made an Arenic demand there that there can be no essentialisms. Oh. But aren't demands themselves in some ways part of an essentialistic arena? Demands basically say there's such thing as a no, and that no ought to be have a standing. It ought to have an ontology. It ought to have an eternality. It ought to be out there, because many people are like, well, I don't believe in black and white things. Okay, just kind of made one. These things are so difficult to escape, and that's why I always say there's always the antithetical, yes, no, and there's always sort of the nuance. They both inhabit the same world, and in fact, they derive their power from the existence of the other. That's a pretty pervasive duality.
Is there literally such a thing as a male soul trapped in a female body? Or
now we're using the word literary. Well, I'd say that Peter Pan is a literary figure. There literally is a Peter Pan. Is there one biologically? Is there one physically that is connected to all the attributes that we discover about Peter Pan? Peter Pan is very literal.
or vice versa? I personally don't believe there is, but I'm a little biased. I sold my soul to a Sudanese businessman,
and what ContraPoints often does is gets out of sort of a corner with a joke.
all I got in return was this shitty ketamine habit.
There is no gendered soul. Soul is...
Again, now we're just making assertions. There is no gendered soul. Okay, how do you know there is none? The best I think he could say would be, I can't demonstrate there is one, so I'm going to live as if there isn't. Oh, okay. But that demand, that assertion, I don't know that you can make that.
a metaphor, but nothing real. Instead, we need
It's a metaphor, but nothing real. Okay, real with respect to what?
conceptual distinction between biologically conditioned chromosomal sex and psychologically and socially contingent gender.
Okay, and if you use this language of agent arena, you can very easily manage that. Here's the arena of biology, where male and female. Here's the region of psychology. But part of what's interesting about these debates often is that I tend to find a lot of psychology done in previous years just sort of thrown away. And in fact, a lot of social games in previous years sort of thrown away. They continue to be thrown away, such as all of these claims that if women ruled the world, there would be no wars. And that just sort of leaves the door open for Matt Walsh to come in and say, what is a woman? And this way, again, well, it's sort of fun to play fast and loose with these arenas, but they're not so easily dispensed with, because on one hand, I want to play fast and loose. On the other hand, it's sort of the Mott Bailey thing. I want to retreat to it.
So, in a strict sense, there is no gender identity. There's no correct gender role that corresponds exactly to.
And again, when he says in a strict sense, well, if you would label the arena, it would be a much better sentence. And if you're failing to label the arena, what are you saying?
To a person's biology. And there are multiple ways of feeling, for instance, male or female. Gender identity is incongruent or dissonant. This is somewhat comparable to what we could call age identity. Age identity, too, is dissonant and incongruent. Like, I never feel really identical with my age. I'm not going to tell you what my age is, but please believe
Late 40s, early 50s?
me. I often feel that I am actually somewhat younger than my body biologically is. And also, the social aspects of my age don't really correspond to how I feel about my age. Now, I'm not saying that gender and age are the same thing, but
Again, arenas. Age is sort of an arena. It's within a biological arena. It's within a temporal arena. Not all those things function within every arena.
I do think that in both cases, an incongruity and a dissonance of identity is palpable. There's no perfect match between one's sex, one's gender roles, and how one feels about one's gender.
And feeling's just a slippery place, of course, because how I feel now and how I feel now might be very different things. And how I feel when I walk out the door and how I feel when I hear some news. I mean, feelings are just signals.
The relation between sex and gender is contingent. One can be male or female in multiple different ways. And these ways can...
And again, if you'd introduce arenas to that, you can probably have a lot more clarification.
And do change for any individual during their lifetime. Like, it's different to be male as a child, as a teenager, as a grown-up, or
Notice again, all the different arenas.
as an old man. And of course, historically and socially, what it means to be a man or woman also changes big time. Now,
Historically, because what it means to be a man in 15th century England, what it means to be a man in 8th century China, what it means to be a man in 21st century Sacramento, California. Exactly.
gender identity is not identical. Chromosomes, thoughts, and social gender are not perfectly in line. There's always some sort of tension, a certain degree of difference between them. And unfortunately,
And those differences have everything to do with the arenas that they're in.
this tension can be extreme and painful. Transgender people, like ContraPoints, often suffer from gender dysphoria,
Those terms also have arenas.
a strong dissonance or incongruity between chromosomal sex, gendered body, and the gendered social persona, and inner feelings about one's gender. This is what ContraPoints says.
Gender dysphoria is a state of social, emotional, anatomical, sexual, spiritual, and sartorial angst relating to one's assigned birth sex, which is mostly relieved by socially and medically transitioning to the gender of one's psychological identity.
Now, there's lots of assertions in there, but because of all the arenas, you're basically saying, well, there's tensions between these arenas. And there are. I can have tensions that I just had a conversation today with Manuel, which I thought went well for his channel. He has these questions that he asks. And I talked about the tensions between sort of a posture of service in myself in the ministry arena as pastor, in the ecclesiastical arena, and let's say the posture that I have as a father of a family in this familial arena.
This is what motivated me to transition, and I endorse the mainstream scientific view.
So, moreover,
As if they're, well, the mainstream scientific view, when? Those have arenas too?
the body has always been gendered as well. It's not simply reducible to biological sex. Biological features relate to gender. But today, due to developments in science and medicine, the gendered body is changeable to
Okay. Now again, more arenas and changing of arenas.
quite an extent. Beyond the chromosomal level, bodily features indicating gender can be altered, like through hormones or surgery, for instance.
And then you sort of have Mary Harrington's, oh, well, is medicine different when we are not trying to, let's say, restore a certain type of natural, we go back to this word natural function, and when we're trying to inhibit it? Well, that's really difficult because, of course, in some ways cancer is natural, but cancer treatments try to inhibit it. So all of that has within it a lot of layers too.
So, to sum up, gender identity is a social, psychological, bodily construct. We may call it a narrative. Despite all these incongruities, the dissonances and contingencies,
And when you call it a narrative, well, now we're putting it in another interesting arena.
despite the non-perfect match of the different aspects of gender and sex, this narrative suggests to both individuals
And it's interesting because, again, the non-perfect match, well, what do you mean by that? Well, sex, biology, that maps really well. But what about when I walk into a locker room at a gym, not paying a lot of attention to the signs on the door, and begin to take my clothes off, and then a group of women come in. Well, now we have a biological arena and a different arena, and one is governing the other, and so someone is out of place. And there'll be embarrassment, there'll be who knows what there'll be.
and society at large that a specific gender is part of every single person's identity. It's a central aspect of who one is.
Now, this is interesting too, because what it notes is that human beings are really amazing creatures, that we live amidst innumerable arenas. That's one of the amazing things about human beings that differentiate us from the animal kingdom, where dogs function, most animals don't function in many different arenas. We have numerous arenas, numerous hierarchies. A lot of those arenas are subtly interwoven and interconnected.
And the narrative suggests counterfactually unity, essence, congruity of the gender itself. People identify as and are identified as in terms of gender. And that is very important and even indispensable. We couldn't have an identity in the way we have it if it wouldn't be gendered. Everybody must be gendered. Now,
It's because, again, a function of certain arenas. And this is, of course, where some getting rid of the gender binary is simply going to fall apart, because the gender binary is in many ways downstream and deeply connected to the sexual binary. And unless you are going to eliminate the biological level, and again, this is part of people's imaginations, you are not going to get rid of the gender binary in many, many, many different arenas.
as viewers of this channel will maybe know, in my view, there are several identity technologies to construct this necessary sense of identity, this sense of who one is, this narrative that covers up the factual incongruity and dissonance so that we can live with it. And these technologies are also applicable to gender. The first technology is sincerity, an orientation to social roles. In the case of gender, an orientation to...
Part of what I wanted to make this video about, instead of just always trolling to say, arena, 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 what he does, and I think his whole Profilicity shtick, is really helpful, because the point that he just made about technology, what we do with technology is that, especially the technologies that we've been creating with respect to social media platforms, is we have continued to multiply arenas. You are watching me in YouTube.
Traditional gender roles. The second technology is authenticity. It means the pursuit of originality. It finds identity in individual selfhood. One is supposed to find one's true self below the mass of social roles.
Now, his sincerity and authenticity, I don't know that his definitions really are terribly strong, because, well, number one, these are tremendously difficult words to define. And when we think about what we do when we define words, we're trying to get a handle on their essential meaning. There's some essences out there. There's something out there, but it's a pretty slippery thing. Pursuit of originality. Originality? I mean, not a good definition.
And then there's profilicity.
And this is the one that I think, for me, this is the one that it's worth paying attention to him with.
Identity construction through the curation, the display, and the social validation of profiles.
This is the one that I like, because now we're really talking an arena. Now I think we're getting into this transgressive, because in many ways a lot of Trump's power comes from being transgressive and unapologetically transgressive. You're not able to use transgression without all of these other elements in the world. So Profilicity, I like that, because now we're saying, we've got these arenas. And ContraPoints is working powerfully with Profilicity. Her videos drip with them.
Let's talk about gender sincerity. People used to shape a sense of their gender identity in orientation through gendered social roles of man or woman. In the family, this could be wife and husband, or mother and father.
Look at all these arenas.
In religion, it could be nun and monk. And in a sincerity society, it could also be tied to professions like whatever, warrior and nurse. All these roles can be, they don't have to be, but they can be strongly gendered. And then in sincerity,
strongly gendered in many ways. The gender sort of evolves out of the biological.
Gender identity basically consists in sincere commitment, kind of devotion to these gendered roles. This is then typically also tied to a morality, to certain gendered values. Like honor is perceived as a commitment to gender roles. To just give one of myriad examples, in ancient China, this goes back to the Han Dynasty 2,000 years ago, there was a book called Biographies of Exemplary Women, Lian Yu Zhuan. It's a compilation of stories about female role models. For instance, they don't remarry after their husband's death or stuff like this. So typically, Gender sincerity comes with gender metaphysics or gender theology or gender metapsychology.
Because those arenas are very are very real within those cultures.
The biographies of the exemplary women, for instance, are supposed to show what ideal femininity is. Interestingly,
Okay, so ideal, that means that there is a hierarchy, there are ideals, and then your conformity within it, and that seems to be where what he's meaning by this sincerity.
ContraPoints mentions a case of what I would call transgender sincerity.
Some cultures have ancient third gender traditions, such as the Hijra of South Asia, a legally recognized gender in India, Pakistan, Nepal, and Bangladesh.
Interestingly, ContraPoints mentions a case of what I would call transgender under conditions of sincerity. Third genders, such as the Hijra, who ContraPoints talks about here, in traditional societies are typically tied to very strict gender roles. They're not open to any individual who can freely choose them.
And I think the point he makes here is excellent, that there's a fundamental difference between within the arena of, let's say, expressive individualism, of acting in this particular way and then making claims on, let's say, gender essentialism or theological gender, as he's been calling it, and the arena of these other cultures and these other expressions and modes and identities. Well, they're very, very different. And I appreciated the fact that often this is just sort of like, well, what's the matter with you? It's only because of Christianity and the darn Bible that you think God made us man and woman. What about these? Well, and you say, well, okay, but to what degree are these castes, and how do they relate to caste? And part of what you're trading on is that the Bible, especially Old and New Testaments, there's a tremendous amount of egalitarianism, and the impact of Christianity, you're basically, once again, using Christianity to try to undermine it.
Hijras are socially very low. They are typically born males, and the community functions somewhat similar to a caste. Role expectations are strict, stable over time, and there's a strong conformity demand.
And it's the stability over time that is, of course, a real part of the question of gender identity. If I can, within the duration of this video, basically assume infinite numbers of gender identity and the rest of the world must comply, that's not going to work very well.
The Hijra can do, how they live is in accordance with the gender role Hijra.
It's an arena.
So third genders are also often based on a sort of gender theology, a gender metaphysics, or gender metapsychology, right?
Because those elements are common throughout the rest of human history.
Suppose that God made them like this, that they have, for instance, a Hirja essence or soul. Typically, today's transgender discourse, including that of ContraPoints, does not advocate transgender as a third gender role. It certainly does not demand that transgender people commit to rigidly defined gender expectations. Therefore, I think it would be quite a grave mistake to idealize traditional third genders. They typically function under conditions of sincerity in strict orientation to strict roles. However, there are still advocates of gender sincerity in the postmodern West. One recent example is Mary Harrington, a popular reactionary feminist and author of the book Feminism Against Progress. She is a good example of what could be called new sincerity. She argues that the family, the traditional family, is still needed.
And you can see the more he uses the word sincerity, the more we're kind of getting a sense of what he means by that.
Defends Article 41.2 in the Irish Constitution, which goes, by her life within the home, woman gives to the state a support without which the common good cannot be achieved. This, according to Harrington, is a profoundly humane provision for the unique nature of mothering, which, according to her, is now vanishingly rare in developed world legislation. Moreover, she advocates some sort of sex asymmetry and a kind of gender metaphysics. She's against new cyborg technologies which, according to her, alter the natural sex, which she regards as a threat. So obviously, gender sincerity and a sincere notion of gender identity is politically very different from ContraPoint's point of view. So interestingly, ContraPoints is not just implicitly against gender sincerity, but also explicitly against gender authenticity. Gender authenticity, I propose, found its classic expression in Simone de Beauvoir's work. She's, so to speak, the mother of gender authenticity. Gender authenticity argues against gender as gender roles. It wants to overcome gender.
And this is a great point here too, because, and this is the tension that you see between, let's say, second wave feminism and some transgender assertions, let's call it that.
Gender roles to allow for sovereign individuality that transcends gender. According to Beauvoir, gender roles prevent women and men from becoming authentic individuals. So, for the sake of developing authentic individuality.
Now, this is where this authentic gets a little slippery, because you mean this action where my will is validated. And this is where this word authenticity remains fairly slippery. And it, you know that it's functioning within an arena, but it's not always easy to really get a sense of the essence of that arena.
Gender roles have to be overcome. Or in other words, for the authentic individual, gender is inessential. And personal identification in orientation to gender roles, for instance, husband or wife, is a sign of inauthenticity. Interestingly, in the intro to her famous book, The Second Sex, de Beauvoir writes, Dorothy Parker has written, I cannot be just to books which treat of woman as woman. My idea is that all of us, men as well as women, should be regarded as human beings.
Okay, so there's a hierarchy, and saying, well, but of course that hierarchy is going to be dependent on which arena. If you walk into a gynecologist office and say, don't treat me as a woman, treat me as a human being, and the gynecologist will say, the whole purpose of the arena of this office is that you are a woman.
By the way, Dorothy Parker was an American writer at the time. I've never been able to verify this quote. If someone can find it, that would be great. Anyway, what de Beauvoir does in her whole philosophical project is basically take this sentence and simply replace the expression human beings with the expression authentic individuals. Gender as gender roles impose a social conformity. And the point is to find one's individual authenticity by rejecting this conformity.
And there we might get a little bit closer to what we mean by this language.
Now, importantly, de Beauvoir acknowledges biological sex differences. She does not want to abolish gender completely, but move beyond gender roles. You should not want to be seen as woman, or as man for that matter, or as transgender.
Again, probably within a political or economic or business arena.
But you should simply be your authentic self.
Which, of course, makes no sense if you're not paying attention to the arena. I'm going to be my authentic self by roller skating through the office. You will probably find yourself within the arena of the office an ex-employee.
Be who you are. In a very critical video about TERFs, trans-exclusive radical feminists, ContraPoints attacks the notion of gender authenticity. She critically caricatures the quest for authenticity beyond gender by actually ascribing the demand to abolish gender to TERFs.
But you should be moving beyond the patriarchal constructs of masculinity and femininity, not conforming to them. Real feminism aims to abolish gender, not reinforce it. Abolish gender? Well, that sounds like an ambitious project for one transsexual, but I mean, I'll give it a try. Solanus be praised. No nails, no makeup. I'm wearing a nice little gender-neutral robe moment. I did it, everyone. I abolished gender. Well, I guess long hair is still a gender signifier, so I should probably get rid of that. How is she, though? She's feeling a little genderless. I guess the way I position my body is still gendered, and there's a gendered cadence to my voice. So what I'm gonna do is just hold
Very much a gendered cadence to the voice, so
my hands up genderlessly and speak in a genderless robot voice. My name is 5466417. I have no gender. Patriarchy is over. I guess English is still a patriarchal language, right? So I should probably be communicating with a series of genderless sounds. Near, 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 near. I can't stand this. Fuck this.
I think that's a little bit unfair exaggeration of de Beauvoir
but point made.
and also of TERFs, who don't really want to abolish gender altogether, but more precisely abolish traditional gender roles.
They want change.
However, ContraPoints has a very valid point here. The idea that there is an authentic self beneath all the gender roles that transcends gender distinctions and is somehow gender neutral is indeed utopian. I agree with ContraPoints. Authentic identity that transcends gender completely does not really exist.
Does not really exist. We spent all of that time at the beginning, and we're going to hear it at the end. No gender theology, no gender essentialism. But yet we struggle to find human beings apart from it. What does that mean?
And even if it existed, one couldn't identify with it in a thoroughly gendered society. Importantly, ContraPoints explicitly rejects the typical authenticity claim.
Now, what he just said, one couldn't, in a thoroughly... That was part of Mary Harrington's experience, that she, in this radically egalitarian lesbian community, discovered hierarchies just come. They just happen. They're all over the place.
One often hears in transgender discourse. Just to give you one example, there's been a TV series, it's not that well known, it's titled Always Jane. It's about a transgender woman named Jane. And the title already emphasizes that Jane has always been a woman. Like, that's unchanging gender metaphysics. And that her new gender is her original self. And the TV series advertises.
And again, pay attention to her original self. And wait a minute. Obviously, part of this is so when people are, let's say, pronoun absolutists in one particular way, because there's another side that's pronoun absolutist too. What do you mean by original? Suddenly, everything in language is or isn't being changed.
Her whole process of gender transition as a journey towards living authentically. I think, in McLuhan's terminology, this is a typical contemporary media rear view mirror.
Now, I haven't watched his McLuhan video. I saw that was one of the... I haven't followed his channel carefully for a couple of years.
Mirror view. It describes profilicity with the old semantics of the past, namely the semantics of authenticity.
Okay, put profilicity in there. And I think it's helpful because we quickly forget, oh, wait a minute, where's all this happening? Well, a lot of it's happening on screens.
ContraPoints, however, clearly rejects the popular authenticity narrative.
Hang on, I'm going to kill the live stream. I don't think we're seeing anything new on the channel, on the Living Stones channel where I'm streaming the Parking Lot Project.
I think of myself as a woman who used to be a man, rather than as always having been a woman.
Now, finally, we get to...
So, right, different people, different takes. Okay, but for the rest of the country watching this, it's always presented as transgender as one thing. And then don't dead name. There's one rule. And the rest of us watching this are like, you say this and you say that, and this is totally novel to us. So if y'all want to be in one category, you better get your act together. Because even if, and all of this, how we treat one another is very much negotiated. So if you really want us to be on one page and to actually negotiate with you as if you're one thing, at least find some consensus on this, because there is none. Because otherwise, all we get are sort of these tyrannical demands to do this or do that. And it's simply confusing.
Gender profilicity. It's gender identity construction through the curation, display, and social validation of profiles.
And I think that's really helpful. I find his profilicity concept helpful in terms of the emerging arena of these social media platforms. And so then suddenly this Flip Wilson and Geraldine, and when this biological creature is Flip Wilson, and when he's Geraldine, because right there the pronoun that I'm using is important in terms of which arena. And a lot of what we have, as I thought Sam nicely said, is we've got a lot of people changing arenas on us. And that's super confusing, because pretty much arenas are very important things in terms of how we relate to one another, because we're going to have a degree of arenic agreement if we know how to be agents within it peacefully and productively.
Actually quite similar to how Judith Butler conceived of gender in her famous book, Gender Trouble, namely in terms of performativity. ContraPoints refers to Butler in a video. It's generally affirmative, but she also criticizes it as incomplete for political reasons. Let's listen.
Are you going to try to make me read Judith Butler again? I'll summarize it. Gender is a series of gestures. It's called performativity.
So this is a nice example here. Why? Well, you've got an arena, it's a stage, it's a set, it's all of these different actions, everything. And if you watch ContraPoints, everything in the set is intentional. They, ContraPoints, and the people that produce the videos work together in making sure what's on the set has a message. You see it all the time in ContraPoints videos. Now we have ContraPoints as two people. This is in some ways the consciousness congress of ContraPoints.
It's the way you dress. It's the way you speak. It's the way you act. It's the way you relate to other people. Through transitioning, we habituate to the gestures of womanhood, and socially, that makes us women, regardless of biology or psychology. Checkmate transphobes. Okay, the problem with that is that it's both too exclusionary and too inclusive. It excludes a lot of trans people who can't transition for circumstantial reasons, but whose dysphoria is very real. And it includes every trans-trender, drag queen, fetishist, and 2-bit cross-dressing comedian in a Dinah wig.
So ContraPoints argues here for both more
Geraldine made the talk there. Did you hear that?
inclusive and exclusive understanding of transgender identity developed out of Butler's notion of performativity. I agree with that, and I would call that, although it's obviously not a concept ContraPoint uses, she doesn't formulate any, gender profilicity. In many of her videos, ContraPoint
And I think this is helpful.
speaks of her own gender identity in line with gender profilicity. She says that gender identity cannot be reduced only to inner psychology, to what people think gender is. So again, she speaks out against gender meta-psychology or gender authenticity.
If psychological identity were the only thing that mattered, then there would be no need for a trans person to come out or do anything to transition, including requesting different pronouns, because pronouns belong to the social world of language, not to individual psychology.
Now, even the language of coming out is arenic. You notice that? I never really noticed that before. And part of what's going on here, and it's often the case that when I do a Randall's Conversation, someone who's been watching me for a long time, and I have very much the same experience with some of you if I've been watching you for a long time, is that there's sort of an arenic transition when I'm watching YouTube and you're talking to me, or if we're on Zoom and we're talking back and forth, and especially if we're in real life, and suddenly there's and when I meet someone for the first time, I'm a pastor, happens in church all the time. Someone walks in, they've never been in the church before. It's a very normal thing. But somebody that I've talked to on screens or watched on screens, or now suddenly I'm in the same room, there's a different whoosh. Because suddenly what there has been is in my mind, in the arena of Paul Vanderklay's head, I've constructed someone. I've constructed Jordan Peterson or Jonathan Peugeot or John Vervaeke or Cassidy, or, I remember meeting Cassidy for the first time. It was in our West Coast tour when we were down in Tucson. Cassidy was living in Phoenix, and Cassidy comes in, and it's like suddenly I didn't realize all of the assumptions that I had about Cassidy that I wasn't even aware of, that had to do a lot with her physicality. She was shorter than I thought. She was smaller than I thought. Now, I'm a big guy. Shouldn't have come as any surprise, but there's nothing rational about this. It's all sort of implicit. And so these arenas they're multiplying fast, and we're really struggling to keep up with them.
Instead, she says,
But gender is also social, structural, and interpersonal.
interpersonal here means interpersonal validation. It means to be treated as a woman, for instance.
You don't become a woman the first time you put on a dress. You become a woman the first time an older female relative turns to you at a restaurant and says, maybe you should order the salad, sweetie.
There's the arena. And now we're seeing, in many ways, your identity is negotiated within an arena, which is why you're looking for validation.
It also means, importantly, to be seen by the general peer in terms of how your gender is seen. Here's a beautiful quote from ContraPoints.
We want not necessarily to pass perfectly, but at least to seem like our genders to the people around us. As Laura Jane Grace put it, you want them to see you like they see every other girl.
So the seen as that Dorothy Parker and Simone de Beauvoir completely rejected, to treat of woman as woman, becomes, for ContraPoints, to the contrary, the gender-defining act. This is precisely the switch from authenticity to profilicity. Here's some more quotes specifying ContraPoints' gender profilicity.
And I think now, that's what you mean by sincerity. Oh, see, it's all starting to come together. But we see this pretty significant arenic difference between them right there. And this is part of the reason why there's so much tension in the culture over this.
All I can really tell you is that I prefer to express myself with diaphanous feminine gestures, that taking female hormones and having feminizing medical procedures makes me feel more at home in my body, and that I like it when other people treat
and talking a certain way and acting a certain way, much of which I remember when Jordan Peterson was coming back from the whole benzo thing, and they did this first one big interview, and the female reporter takes a swipe at Michaela for how she wears her hair and how she comes across. And it's like, so much for liberation. One person's liberation is the next person's tyranny.
treat me as a woman, socially, spiritually, sexually.
For her, gender identity is to be treated.
So one of the things that is passing around, I saw someone had sent me the Whatever podcast, and they make the little thought experiment. Would you rather have sex with the oldest woman in the world or with the hottest trans woman? And if you had sex with a trans woman, would that make you gay? And I mean, right there it's just sort of an arena switching and say, okay, well, what's true? Let's put these things up together and say, what would you rather do? And people freak out.
That in a gendered way, socially, spiritually, sexually. Of course, importantly, on top of mere social validation of transgender people, ContraPoints also argues very forcefully for the political goal of transgender equality.
New arena.
That is politically central for her.
And okay, equality is such a difficult thing to strive after.
I feel like trans culture is just so obsessed with reassuring ourselves that we are valid that we sometimes forget that the end goal of a political movement is not validity, it's equality.
Ah, there's the hierarchy.
That's what we're supposed to be fighting for. So instead of asking, does J.K. Rowling think we're valid? Which, who fucking cares if she thinks we're valid? Well, maybe I care a little bit. But
And this is part of why ContraPoints is pretty good at what she does.
instead, why don't we ask, is she or is she not an ally in our struggle for equality?
However, in this video, I'm not focusing on the political struggle, but on an existential understanding of gender identity. And in that clip too, ContraPoints adds that she too cares about social validation by J.K. Rowling. Moreover, ContraPoints highlights that gender profile validation is especially important for extremely online trans people.
Plus, a lot of extremely online trans people really don't have a strong sense of conviction in their own identity, which is why they need constant external validation to prop them up.
Ah, now we're getting at the nature of this arena. Someone had sent me I had listened to it before. Helen Lewis has a podcast on gurus and an episode with David Fuller on Jordan Peterson. And she talks about internet sickness, which is a lot like this. Her internet sickness is more like audience capture, but spend too much time in this internet arena and, well, that arena has power. It shapes. And that's when you get to the meta-divine realm, what Kaufman talks about, it's a serious power.
They need to constantly be told that they're valid, that they really are the gender that they say they are.
It's probably fair to say that ContraPoints, with her millions of viewers, also qualifies in a way as an extremely online trans person. Importantly, today, compared with, let's say, 20 years ago, actually most people, including myself, are extremely online. The extreme has become the new normal. So in an extremely online life, which is now normal for most people, validation is increasingly crucial. This is also a big part of the rise of Profilicity.
Right. And that's where I think the word really has use.
And in Profilicity, how the body image is seen as is also very crucial. ContraPoints says,
But I'm not like, oh yeah, I have tits now, that's so hot. I mean, it's kind of hot. But it's more about other people being into it than it is about me being into it.
how the body profile.
And this is what arenas do for us. Arenas allow us to play within them, and it's specific, and it's powerful, and it's desirable. But you've got to keep the arenas straight. You don't want your doctor getting turned on, or maybe you do, but you want your doctor to live within a specific arena, and you want your lover in another one.
Is being seen contributes to one's gender identity being serious. Here's an interesting expression of one of ContraPoints' most pressing concerns.
I'm afraid that people will never take me seriously as a woman, hence ruining any chance I have at happiness.
For her, to be taken seriously means to be taken seriously as a woman.
Right. And what we do in these arenas really matters to us. These arenas are powerful, and our identity is deeply connected with our agency.
Only this produces for her happiness. To be taken seriously as one's gender is crucial to be able to be truly invested in one's profile. Happiness is produced by being taken seriously as.
Now we're knocking on Jordan Peterson's door again. What is happiness is about meaningfully striving up that hierarchy, isn't it? About having effective agency within an arena. So once that particular arena begins to dominate, well, there it is.
Is one's gender. Only in this way can one be truly invested in one's gender identity. You become your gender by successfully creating a gender profile, and then by being able to be truly invested in it.
That's rather a collapse, but I think it's part of what's going on with this, with our profiles in these online arenas.
And this can make people happy.
My view is well expressed by Catherine McKinnon.
I always thought I don't care how someone becomes a woman or a man. Doesn't matter to me. Anybody who identifies as a woman, wants to be a woman, is going around being a woman, as far as I'm concerned, is a woman.
What arena are you in when you make a claim like this? Because I can very quickly imagine a number of arenas in which that would wither and pass away quickly. And this is where we get into the question of real. Because real is multiple arenas in which the same thing still holds true and in fact dominates, colonizes, controls, impacts, influences, all of those things.
Identity is achieved by identifying as, in the sense of successfully profiling as. In this regard, it's really important to signify, to display signs as part of one's profile.
We're using a cultural language of feminine signifiers to prompt others to see us for what we are.
Identity is achieved once you have successfully prompted the general peer by the display of signs.
Hence, it's negotiated.
Here's a perfect short formulation.
I'm presenting in such a meticulously feminine way.
Again, there's a complete rejection of gender metaphysics. The point is not to authentically be a gender, that's impossible, but to present in a meticulously gendered way. Now here's a...
And again, if you would have some awareness of arenas, you could help clean that up a bit.
conclusion. What ContraPoints not just says, but what she does, successfully creating a gendered profile identity that is validated by millions of viewers.
Ah, there it is, isn't it? It's Geraldine. ContraPoints lives on a screen.
Is gender identity under the conditions of profilicity.
And I think he's exactly right.
Transgender is a striking example of general gender identity today, because here the incongruity, dissonance, and non-identity that gives rise to and necessitates profile creation is very obvious. But any gender identity today can be shaped with the same identity technology. We can not only be transgender, but also men or women under the conditions of profilicity. In the past, we shaped gender identity in conformity to social roles, female, male, or third gender.
So your profilicity, there's your arena. There's your online, your on-screen arena. If you walk into a room and you have 3 million Twitter followers, and people know you have 3 million Twitter followers, suddenly that arena is transformed by your status. Other people who aren't on Twitter. I notice this because my children are aware of musicians and actors that I have absolutely no knowledge of, some sports people. And I often think if that person walked into church, I would look at them and I'd probably say, oh, they're kind of young. But I wouldn't know them at all. And then they'd give me their name, and I wouldn't know them at all. And then someone else might say, oh, what? That's so-and-so. Okay. So what? Oh, they are, and then bang, profile, Profilicity. And there's an arena where they have status and a reality that may or may not transfer into the arena that of Living Stones or of Sacramento or of whatever we're in.
Gender. And many people still do this today. Then, in the age of authenticity, we pursued originality beyond gender. We tried to become who we are, not as woman or as man. But now we increasingly realize that this is impossible. Today, a new gender identity option, especially for billions of extremely online people, is the creation and true investment in a gender profile. None of these gender identities is more or less right or more or less correct. Gender is incongruent and contingent. No
Upon arenas.
psychological or social concept of gender matches correctly chromosomal sex.
But he doesn't mention, but it's deeply tied to it.
There can be a painful dissonance or
And in many ways, the transgender is sort of the bookends of the second wave feminists. There they are. And all it is it's essentially there. It's the hypersexuality, and we talked about this in the previous video. Or it's the Maoist, everybody is wearing that shapeless suit and pants and hat. Or there it is. We've bookended the thing.
extreme incongruity between sex and gender. It's called gender dysphoria. As with all aspects of identity, we need to be able to successfully identify in terms of gender to form a sense of self. However, an existentialism of the 21st century recommends not to over-identify with one's gender.
Well, tell me what is over.
Not to become a gender fundamentalist.
Oh, well, that's interesting.
One way of over-identifying with one's gender is to overcommit to gender congruity and to submit one's body to invasive medical regimes to better fit a given gender profile.
Now, do you mean don't get cosmetic surgery? Or do you mean no sexual gender alignment surgery? That statement he just made there is very interesting. I think he means one and not the other. It's like, well, wait a minute. Why not one or the other? Why not both? Or why not say no to both?
Such regimes can be psychologically and medically dangerous.
Oh.
They're not limited to any specific gender. Cosmetic surgeries, for instance, are applied by all genders today to create a gender profile.
Really? I guess I could get a hair transplant. Is he against hair transplants?
Instead of over-identification, we can exercise genuine pretending.
Oh, this is interesting. Genuine pretending. You can't just use pretending. It has to be genuine pretending.
On the one hand, being truly invested in a value.
Now we've got the sort of the laying the language on. We're going to lay the language on thick here for emphasis.
Gender profile, but on the other hand, understanding that there is no true gendered self.
Oh, okay. Back to the skepticism. Now he's going to have his mic drop moment, which again sort of gives us the bookends.
Reject gender metaphysics and theology.
And that's how he ends. And in fact, that's what he says, and then now gets up out of his chair.
All right, that's it.
That's the last word for him right there, which basically puts him on a par with everyone who says ContraPoints is a he. ContraPoints is a he. That's the fight you want to have? Okay. Are you going to fight that fight in every arena? Okay. And in some ways, I understand that, because that is in some ways the dominant top arena. But when you reject it like this, you sort of make it the dominant top arena too. And so you're playing the same game. So anyway, I thought it was a very interesting video. I learned a lot from it. I appreciated parts of it. I continue to appreciate the, if you understand arenas, the value of the Profilicity term. And it was cool. Now, this, again, will once again be controversial among some of you, because you'll just basically take the exact opposite pole of what Mueller does. So it doesn't bother me. Have at it. And leave a comment.